us. So I'm going to skip through our introductions because we did those yesterday. But again, all the materials that we're presenting here today with you, you will find in the Google Classroom stream where we've loaded these documents. So if you weren't able to join us yesterday and are here today, know that you can find those introductions for our presenters today, our advisors there. Just a reminder, as we venture into our workshop today, if you could keep your cameras on and mics off. So there's a question about the link for Google Classroom that should have been sent to you as an invite a week or two ago. And if you haven't received that, maybe check your junk folder. It's possible that it's in spam somewhere. And if you don't see it there, please let one of us know so that we can have that resent to you and you can have access to that. So just as a reminder, keep those cameras on, mics off. Please use that chat box. It'll be a great way for us to connect with you, especially when we post questions. And again, all those workshop materials will be uploaded into Google Classroom today. Next week, we'll start diving into the topic of classroom management. So on Tuesday, that will be our next workshop. For the workshop starting next week, we will just be with our specific region. So we will part ways and the central region will just be having their workshop together, and then the eastern region will be just them and their workshop going forward. So, and then on Thursday, we have approaches to teaching and activities, diving a little bit more into connecting things we can do with the textbook, which we'll touch upon a little bit today. To get us started off first, we're going to have Tom talk to us a little bit more about what goes into an actual lesson. And Tom, I'm not sure if you wanted to lead this part yourself, but I'm more than happy to control on this and just let me know.
I'm going to do the Pear Deck again, so okay. I don't mind taking over.
Okay, perfect. I will stop sharing then.
All right. Give me just a second here, everybody. Okay, so for those of you who joined us yesterday, same basic idea. I'll put the link here in the chat and the join code. There you go. You can go to joinpd.com and then enter TKNKID, and there's this nice mnemonic here: troubling kangaroos neatly keeping sincere drums. And I'll just wait until we have about 40 or so students connected here, and then I'll get started. And I can actually paste the link in the chat too. I'll just do that. There we go. Make things a little bit easier. And while we're waiting for just a couple more folks to join, I do want to sell how great Pear Deck is. And I used to use it all the time in my in-person classes. So if you have any questions about it, please send me a message, send me an email, or just get in touch with me online. Okay, so we've got 42 people here. I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to make this full screen. All right, so I'm going to talk about lesson components. This is just an introduction. So each section, my colleagues will go into more detail on, especially when it comes to objectives and some other things. So I'm just sort of skimming the surface the same way I did yesterday when it came to TESOL acronyms. So unfortunately, the one problem with Pear Deck is that it doesn't allow GIFs to play. So I had this nice little animation here of these hands parting the curtains on the lesson plan document that you will become very, very familiar with. You can just see it here. It almost increases the anticipation, right? So yeah, without further ado, we're going to start with materials. So obviously you need something to teach a lesson, and it really depends on the context. You're going to get tired of hearing that, but I do want you to think about the context and try and answer this. What are the most important materials for your teaching context? So go ahead and type your answers into the chat. Think about the age of your learners. Think about access to technology. Think about what kind of school you're going to be teaching in. Think about how heavy it is to carry a bunch of stuff in your bag. All right, so let's just see what some of the responses are here. Okay, visuals and tangible objects, fantastic. Stationery, storybooks, flags, websites. That's a lot, excellent. Laptops, okay. Patience and a sense of humor. Getting a little bit meta here. Multimedia and tangible objects, all right. We like to call a lot of these things realia. And that's when you bring, if you're going to be talking about a pencil, you show a pencil. If you're going to be talking about, a paperweight, you show a paperweight. So yeah, markers, construction paper, scissors, colorful slides. And don't just think that these are for younger learners. High school students and older junior high school students and even adults love to work with stuff like this just as much as little 5- and 6-year-olds. So yeah, very important. As you look down on that lesson plan paper, you have to consider what you need to make the lesson work, what materials you need. And this is interesting, whiteboard. Not all classes have whiteboards, right? You might have a classroom with no board of any kind. You might have a chalkboard in there. So it makes sense to get a hold of your LET ahead of time and just double check, what you might need to bring, what materials you might need to bring. Okay, awesome. Projector. I see that no one is saying overhead projector. I think those are a thing of the past. Although I don't know, maybe not. Next, again, we're not going to talk about this very much because my colleagues will go into this later. Objectives are still maybe the most important part of your lesson plan, because without an objective, you don't really have a clear goal in mind. So you should be asking yourself what you want your students to be able to do. Effie talked about this yesterday, that acronym, the SWBAT. Students will be able to, right? And one of my professors, I remember a million years ago, really cramming it into our heads, we should add the word by. So students will be able to do X, Y, and Z by, and then explain how they're going to do it. Okay, so I want you guys to think about what makes an objective good. Okay, write an example of a good lesson objective. And I'm being purposefully vague, but let's see what you come up with here. Okay, all right, smart objects. Okay, yeah, obviously we have some folks, okay, all right. Yeah, measurable, I think we're gonna probably start to see measurable a lot here. That's key. All right, so again, I'm not gonna talk about this too much, but yeah, it looks like you are all able to get some great ideas here. Students will be able to talk about themselves in the first person present by introducing themselves to one another. See, this is fantastic. It's clear, it's measurable. By the end of the lesson, you can check to see if they are indeed talking about themselves in the first person present by introducing themselves to one another. Excellent. Okay. All right, let's keep going. Background knowledge is obviously very important. You want to know what you're getting yourself into, and you want to know the context, right? You want to know what your students' experiences are, right? What their learning experiences are, what their life experiences are. The better you know their background knowledge, the more you can tap into it. All right, so what do you think are some ways that you can discover your students' background knowledge? Obviously, there's some obvious ways to do this and some not so obvious. Okay, this is probably the most important way, the easiest way, talking to your LET, talking to the other teachers at the school, right? But let's see. Aha, okay, yeah, have them do icebreaker games, pre-test basic conversation. So you can get the information directly from the students themselves. Maybe if they're older learners, you can do things like some sort of simple needs analysis. Introductory question of the day, all right, a bell ringer. That'll get you up and running. I love this one, spend time with them outside of the classroom. Absolutely. The more time you do this, the better teacher you'll be. Okay, so, yep, let's keep going. This ties into the idea of the objective. Sometimes in order to reach that goal, you need to pre-teach some vocabulary words, some phrases, some grammar. Okay. So again, this is something that you'll probably know ahead of time, hopefully. But if you don't, talk to the LET. If you can get a hold of them before you actually get to the school, so much the better. But that isn't always the case. In fact, sometimes you might walk into a classroom and they'll just dump a ton of stuff on you. But as you continue to work and get to know your schools and your contexts, this will help you figure out what you need to pre-teach when you walk into a classroom. And if you have some consistency, then you'll remember from the previous lesson what you taught. Maybe you have to review that before jumping into those target objectives. Okay, so now we get into the meat and potatoes of a lesson, right? The procedures. Now, the reason I have these giant green letters and words here on the screen, and they're going to pop up on every screen, is because time management is key. As you're sitting there planning your lesson, as you're thinking about it and imagining it in your head, you have to consider how much time you're going to spend on each section. So when you do the warm-up, how much time are you going to spend on it? How much time do you need to do an icebreaker? If your lesson is only 45 minutes, how much time can you really devote to warming the students up? If you take 20 minutes to do a warm-up, now you've gone through almost half the class. So make sure that you are practicing your time management skills as you plan and sketch out the lesson. Okay. So what are some fun warm-ups? What are some great warm-ups you think could light a fire, light a passion for your lesson objectives? Get your students' blood pumping. Let's see. Have the class count from 1 to 5 without interrupting. Okay, one another. Yeah, okay, excellent. It's a classic. Anything TPR related? Absolutely. Get them up and out of their seats. Yeah, a simple question like, what did you do this weekend? Especially for older learners. It's a nice, simple bell ringer. Okay, good. And I like that there's a little bit more specificity here. Oh, this is great. You're doing a callback to a prior lesson. Excellent. Bippity bippity bop. Okay, I'm not sure what that game is, but I'm sure it's fantastic. Jumping jacks, absolutely. That nothing gets the blood flowing like jumping jacks. Oh, I love this. Philo Buffalo, yeah. Okay, awesome. Yep. A journal question prompt. Yeah, again, especially for older learners, this can be a great way to just get the class going. All right, excellent. Again, how many minutes? So now you're introducing what you want to focus on, right? And you can see I've highlighted the first letter here, P, right? So this is P in presentation. Okay, you've done your warm-up. Now you're going to introduce whatever. You're going to introduce target grammar. You're going to introduce, if you're doing CLIL, you might be introducing some topic related to biology or chemistry or whatever, right? How much time are you going to spend doing that before the students start to gaze around at the classroom and start chatting with their friends? And then we get to the activities, right? This is the fun part. And you can see with the P and the P and the P here, we have the PPP. So if you ever hear about something like the PPP model, it's the presentation, practice, and production. You present an idea, you practice it with the class, and then you have them produce it. Okay? If you have time, the assessment part comes into the production. Okay? How do you measure what the students have learned? And that goes back to the objective. So students will be able to do XYZ by ABC, right? So how much time do you need to do this? And can you fold that into the activities? Then we want to wrap everything up, review what you've covered so far, and maybe preview something coming up next. If you have time, you can do extensions and adaptation. One of the scariest feelings in the world is to finish the closure portion of the lesson and realize that you have 10 or 15 minutes left and it's just dead air, right? So you always want to plan optional extensions, and you always want to be able to adapt should you have that extra time. If you burn through the first 3-4 parts of the lesson, make sure you have something. Sometimes it's a literal basket with toys and games and all kinds of stuff. Okay. All right. So here we go. I have a challenge for all of you. Sometimes you have to plan a lesson in less than 5 minutes, and trust me, this is going to happen. You're going to be sitting there at your desk in the school, and one of the LETs is going to come up to you and say, "Hey, we have a lesson in 2 minutes. Can you please teach this grammar point?" So I'm wondering if, and I've already started the 1 minute, if in 1 minute you guys can plan some kind of awesome, knock your socks off, make me weep with joy lesson. So I'll give you another 30 seconds and then I'll check the responses. And I'm not sure if my time is okay. I think I'm still okay. All right, so let's take a look here. Oh, see, look at that. This just warms my heart, seeing those 5 letters, one after the other. Okay, I keep skipping. I keep only looking at the top one, so I'm going to go all the way to the bottom here. Okay, pick an object and describe it with adjectives. All right. Colors, introduce different colors, have students point at things that are red, blue, etc. by asking students what color their shirt is. Fantastic. Oh, I like this one. Lesson involving students mimicking a dialogue and slowing them to change it up. Yep. You can do a lot of stuff with theater and drama and all kinds of things. 7 Up, heads down. I mean, I think this game was old when I was in elementary school. Adjective scavenger hunt, fantastic. Flags of the world. Okay. Oh, yeah, look at this. This is fantastic. For those of you who are not familiar with an IPA chart, this is something I highly recommend you familiarize yourself with. I'm sure that some of you have linguistics backgrounds, but if you don't, this is incredibly useful. And just learning how to teach phonics and teach phonemes, or just what the word phoneme means, can make you a better language teacher. And I didn't say English teacher, but actual language teacher, right? Okay, awesome. I like the neatness of this one. I mean, look at this. Whoever this is, this person is a teacher. Look at this. This is just gorgeous. All right. So once you're finished, you've taught the lesson, you've gone through all that stuff, you've crashed and burned, or you're coming out of the classroom and you feel like you could do anything, right? It's the best feeling in the world. You still need to reflect on what happened. This really, really makes you a better teacher, because if you crashed and burned, then you reflect on why. And that meta process, that's crucial. And if you did really, really well, same thing. Why did it work so well? Why did you knock it out of the park? Okay. Looking back on what went wrong, what went right, will make you plan your next lesson that much better. Okay. So remember, lesson plans are a guide. They don't have to be novels. You don't want to cram a ton of stuff into a lesson plan either. It's almost like an outline. Okay. And don't forget to be funny. Everybody reacts to humor. So when in doubt, do something that's going to put a smile on somebody's face. So yeah, that's it. If you have any questions, you can email me, send me a message online, and thanks for listening.
Thanks, Tom. Our next presenter is going to tell us a little bit more about those important objectives, what really drives our lesson. And Effie is going to be our advisor to share more of this.
Yeah, and I'm going to need Kara to help me project the slides. Before I start, because I am just going to jump right into objectives, which are so important, I wanted you guys to just pop really quickly into the chat box. And in the beginning of our workshop, Kara asked you, what are you planning to pack and bring to Taiwan? Well, now I want you to go ahead and type, what is the purpose? What is the objective for what you've identified that you're going to be bringing? And you can just type this without reminding us what it is that you're actually packing. I think it'll be interesting to see what the objectives are. I hope the drumsticks are for actual drums. Okay, yeah, the weather. Hot Cheetos not readily available. All right, hiking, yes. If your objective is to do a lot of hiking here in Taiwan, you definitely need the right shoes. Trail running. Wow, I see a lot of outdoor rationale. This is awesome, guys. All right, so I'm going to talk about lesson objectives, and this is really the starting point for any lesson or any curriculum. And sometimes you don't have full control over what the learning objectives are. Sometimes this is set by the institution that you're teaching under. But in your case, there may be moments where you have to define the objectives for yourselves and the rationale in what you're doing. The activities, that you decide that you're going to have your students do, the production, the presentation, all of that. So I'm going to talk more about that. And as Tom already reminded you, there is that language, the SWABOT. Students will be able to ... And then as an extension of that, by ABC. So how will they actually show that? What are the outcomes? Great. So next slide. Okay, so rationale, why is it important to define objectives? I think it goes without saying, you do need to set the purpose for instruction. Why are you doing what you're doing? Why this activity and not another one? What activities do you plan to have your students do, and what is it supposed to show? So everything has to be aligned. When we talk about learning lesson objectives, you think about it as part of the planning stage, but there's something we also call backwards design in education, where this is where educators go back and assess what they've done in the curriculum or to the curriculum and justify how everything is in alignment. So you might have to do this when you're doing reflection. Do your objectives actually align to the lesson that was delivered? Okay, so I'm going to pause at this point and just ask in the chat box if you have any questions or comments to defining objectives at this point. or if you want to add to this list. Okay, I think it's pretty straightforward. All right, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so I have this, do page 17 is not an objective. Good concrete example. What does that mean? So side-by-side objectives, outcomes. This is just to kind of break it down a little bit. So objectives can be more overarching, more broad, and again, not always within your control. It could be set by the program that you're teaching in or the institution. And then the outcomes are really the concrete what students are supposed to be able to show, measurement, results. Okay, this is often, what outside forces are going to need to see when it comes to funding or program assessment, reassessment, the nitty gritty. Sometimes outcomes, they need to be quantitative. So we need to be able to produce data in numerical forms and not just qualitative. But you don't need to worry about that too much yet. So we could show this through rubrics. Okay, in the next slide, here are examples. So more broad would be students will be able to describe typical morning activities in the past tense. This is very broad. So this could be part of a lesson unit objective. Whereas the outcome of a specific classroom lesson that's maybe going to span over a period or two, by the end of this lesson, students will be able to use specifically, quantifiably, 2 simple past tense regular and 2 irregular verbs. And I gave 2 examples here of both, and then 2 describe typical morning activities. So you can see the outcome is a lot more specific. Okay. So you do want to use clear language for objectives and outcomes. Verbs such as the ones on the chart, verbs such as explain, match. Match is very concrete. Recognize, less so, but more so than something like appreciate, believe, learn, which sounds appropriate, but how exactly do you measure what students are able to learn? So that can be actually very vague language when drafting an objective. Think critically about, of course, we want to highlight and encourage critical thinking, but how do you actually measure that? What more definitive verbs can we align to our lesson? Aside from expressing, students should be able to think critically about X and Y. And then understand as well can be vague. Okay, next slide. So best practices when it comes to lesson objectives and outcomes they should be specific and measurable. They should be linked to prior learning and or lessons. So again, that alignment, connection. And of course, they should be adapted and adjusted over time to the learning context, to your audience. And I put down transparent. This might not matter so much for younger learners because it's not like they're looking out for what the objectives are. They're not reading syllabi and making sure that you're holding to your end of the bargain, your job. But I do believe that when it comes to communicating with your co-teachers, with your colleagues, objectives should be transparent. It should be clear for you as it is clear to the overall program. So you won't always have full control or clarity over this, but be aware of how objectives and outcomes are connected to how you design and deliver lessons. And then sometimes, again, you'll need to define them for yourselves. Okay, so let's go through each of these. It should be 1, 2, 3, 4. So something happened with the formatting. But let's do number 1. Students will be able to learn simple past regular verbs. So this is an objective. And if you can just type in the chat box, is this clear, unclear, quote, quote, bad, why? So I'm more interested in the why. So we're just doing number 1 right now. Good. We talked about this already. Learn as a vague verb. What does learn mean exactly? We use it all the time, but what does it really mean? Yeah. Also, there are many, many simple past regular verbs. So without context, even just, they should be able to learn all of these verbs. What does this mean? How are we going to measure this? It's just too broad, too vague. Yeah, good. Okay, next, students will be able to know the difference between regular past tense versus irregular past tense verbs. A little bit more specific. What do you guys think? Okay, the verb recognize is there. It's more specific, but they should include how they will know the difference, okay? Yeah, the how is missing, and also regular past tense verbs are all ed, but there are many different forms of irregular. So I would say number 2 is almost there, but we do need more definition, more context perhaps. Vague, but overall good. Okay. Yeah, knowing the difference is a better measurable. Okay, good, good. Critical thinking is happening. Okay, number 3, students will be able to identify and underline regular past tense verbs in a passage about morning routines. This, if you can imagine, would be part of a classroom activity lesson. Specific and measurable. Okay. Yeah, sounds good. And then last but not least, thumbs up. Yeah. Students will be able to learn and act out morning routines. What do you guys think about this one? Sounds like fun. There's TPR happening. Love an improv moment. Okay. If the context is language learning, however, how is this objective aligned to a language purpose or focus? Do we need more information? Unclear what morning routine? Yeah. Yeah, I would say we definitely need more of that language aspect. What is this aligned to? Are we learning about verbs, or are we just getting them to move around, appealing to their kinesthetic senses? Okay, I have another activity in the next slide. So I realize this is isolated and you probably would have to imagine an entire unit or more context around this, but here is a sample textbook page on pronunciation. So let's assume that the lesson or the goal is some aspect of pronunciation. So by the end of this listening and speaking activity, based on this page, students will be able to ... go ahead and type in, and try to be as specific as you can. If you just want to focus on PB or TD, you can. You don't have to cover them all. But if you could give me a 1 or 2 sentence objective. Distinguish and produce 4 initial and final consonants by working with minimal pairs. Someone's got that linguistics background. Any more? Did that one just set the bar? Learn the difference between voiced and unvoiced. Excellent. So voiced initial p or p versus silent final p. Okay, great. Any more comments to this? You guys are fast. All right, next slide. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and pop these links, since you can't just click on the screen, in the chat box. So these are 2 articles that I found helpful. The verb chart that I provided you with in one of the slides is that first link from Rochester. So basically how to use more definitive, clear verbs when drafting objectives. And the second one is a really short article from ThoughtCo. I really like ThoughtCo just for kind of general entry-level articles about education. They're short, they're often cited, so it's reliable. Quick article about how to write clear learning objectives. So while you won't always be in a position to draft or write them, you certainly will be exposed to them, and you'll need to know the purpose for what you're doing. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Effie. We're going to transition to the next part of our workshop where we're moving through the lesson plan. We've talked about its different components. We've spent some time talking about the importance and the need for objectives. And our next segment, we're going to be talking about assessments. But before we get too much further, I'm going to have Megan introduce this part and what she would like for you to do.
All right, so in the next section, we're going to be talking about formative assessments. But first, we're going to have a short break. But during this break, I need you to do something. So in the link, I guess they won't be able to see the link on the screen, but I've put it in the chat box. Click on the link, and during the break, we'll give you about 5 minutes. Read through it. It's an infographic, so it should be pretty clear. There's a lot of words. You don't need to read every single word, but read through it so that you can understand the difference between formative and summative assessments. We're going to be focusing on formative assessments, but it's also important to begin to know what a formative assessment is compared to a summative assessment. And Malcolm, do you have a question you want to? I see a hand raised. Do you want to turn on your microphone and say something?
Oh no, sorry, that was an accident. Sorry.
Okay. And then the other thing that I need you to do is we're going to be using Nearpod again. So during the break, open this other link, and that's what we'll be using to go through my part of the presentation. Okay. So it's 10:09 here, or whatever the time zone is where you are. So come back at 15 and have read at least skimmed that infographic and joined the Nearpod. Right, I have 10, 15, but only 17, 18 people in the Nearpod. So go ahead and click that link, and you should be able to see my slides, and then Ting will also help me project her screen so that you can also follow along there, but it is interactive, so please log in. You don't need to log in, just click the link and then you can participate. But if you're watching this recording later, then follow along with Ting's slide. All right. So today's topic is formative assessments. And hopefully we won't have too many internet issues. Sorry. Well, this is coming up again. I want you to type in the, hold on. So while I'm looking at this, you can have another 2 seconds to look at the infographic. Okay, so we've reached the maximum number of students that can enter this. So if you're not able to enter, then you can look at Ting's screen, and you can type in the chat anything that that is written in the interactive slides. Okay, so we aren't able to do everybody at the same time, but you can use the chat box. Okay, so the first question, which you can type either in the chat box or in the slide. What is the difference between formative assessments and summative assessments? Include one example of each of them. So again, if you're able to be one of the students, there's a maximum of 40 apparently in the Nearpod, then you can type that directly there. And if not, then please type it in the chat box. So you've had a moment to look through the infographic, and just in a few words, what is the difference between formative and summative assessments? And when you're finished, click Submit. Okay, monitoring progress while learning versus evaluating it at the end of the lesson. Excellent. Other comments? Used to teach the material. Okay, partly. I can share what some of these other ones have said. Ongoing feedback versus cumulative. Evolution. Okay, so we're not going to look at every single answer, but I can tell from your answers that you have a pretty good grasp on the difference already. So what did I just do? Was that an assessment? Was that an assessment, yes or no? And was it a formative or summative assessment? Yes, it was formative. So the goal was for me to look at how much you understood, and then based on that, I would decide what I wanted to do next. So do I want to spend a little bit more time discussing the difference between formative and summative, or do I feel like you all already got it and I don't need to spend that time? So that was an informal formative assessment that I used to decide what I wanted to do next in this workshop. And I could tell from all your answers that you got the difference between the two. So we understand formative is something that we use during the lesson, during the unit, to see how much students are learning and to adjust our teaching accordingly. Whereas a summative assessment is maybe to show what students have learned at the end of the unit or the year. So we're not going to spend too much time talking about summative assessments, but I'll take a short moment. Why do we need summative assessments? So again, we're going to be focusing mostly on formative, but should we just throw out the summative assessments completely? Why should we assess? So this one you can type in the chat box. Should we get rid of testing altogether? No final exams, no grades, no homework. With some answers that you can write in the sorry. Okay, to see how students compare to the average, to assess the curriculums. Excellent. So there's lots of reasons why we also want to have formative assessments. But in your day-to-day life as an ETA, they are not going to be as important to your teaching. They are part of your students' life. They're there to stay, whether you love them or hate them. You can't get rid of the final exams. But that is often going to be something that's not in our control. And it's often something that in a typical Taiwanese classroom, the LET will probably be the one focused on, the one who will write that summative assessment and might be more focused on preparing the students for it. So for our purposes, the most important type of assessment would be the formative assessment, because it helps us see how our students are learning. Okay. So why should we assess formatively? Formative assessments should inform our future teaching. So that is a very important part of formative assessments. So you're not just testing just to test or to send a report card to mom and dad. You're testing because you want to be a better teacher. You want to understand what your students need to get from point A to point B. You want to see where they are along this path of not knowing to knowing and how you can help them get there. So it can help you with two things. It can help you decide what and when to review. So which things you need to go back and spend some more time on before the summative assessment. And it can also help you decide which students need extra help with which concepts. So in a public school classroom, you're going to have a lot of very different levels and different needs and different interests and different experiences among your students. And they're going to all have different needs. So a formative assessment can help you figure out which students need help with which areas. And then you can discuss with your co-teacher how you can how you can help those students. So one of the advantages of having a co-teaching pair is maybe you could have one group of students work with you and one group of students work with your LET during the same classroom, or other types of differentiated instruction, which is a topic of a future workshop that we're going to talk about. Okay, so the next slide. Assessment should go hand in hand with your learning objectives. This is really, really important. And so this is why we put this section after Effie's section about objectives, is your assessment should be based on your objective. So you should first start with, what do you want to teach your students? What do you want them to be able to do? And then assess them in a way that shows how whether they have achieved this objective or not. Okay, so when we're teaching, especially new teachers, and there's a lot going on, and you have a lot of students and a lot of pressure and you're worried about a lot of different things, you might be tempted just to want to fill those 40 minutes with whatever activity you can think of and try to do the most fun thing that you can think of, or something that the students might like, or anything that to fill those 40 minutes. Or maybe the topic of this unit is animals, so okay, anything about animals. But that's not really what we're trying to do when we're teaching. We want to start with, this is what we want our students to be able to do, and then create some activities that will help them get there, and then check in along the way to see whether they're actually succeeding. And if they're not, then readjust your teaching accordingly. Okay, so the next slide is a couple examples of some objectives and formative assessments. So I want you to look at these and tell me, do you think they match? So let's look at the first one too. So the objective is students will be able to introduce themselves in English. And for a formative assessment, we have a word search with introduction related vocabulary. So things like name, hello, nice to meet you, in a word search. Does that meet the objective? Does that assess the objective rather? You can go ahead and type in the chat box. If you say no, maybe you could also add why not. Okay, Emma says no, I agree. Why is this not a good assessment? Sounds like a good warm-up activity. Okay, yeah. Eventually, you're gonna want to introduce those words, and being able to recognize the words in a word search might be a useful activity or practice. But what you want them to be able to do is introduce themselves in English, and this word search they are not showing that they can do that. So can anyone think of a better formative assessment for that objective? So you want your students to introduce themselves in English as your objective. What should the assessment be? Yeah, have them introduce themselves in English. Excellent. Introduce themselves in partners, maybe to a friend. Right, so you could have a student one by one. You could have one student come to the front and introduce themselves in front of the entire class. And that would be an assessment of this objective. Is it the best assessment of this objective? Maybe not, because it puts a lot of pressure on the student to speak in public, which can be very intimidating. So that's probably not the best way to do it, is one at a time in front of everyone. But that would at least match the objective. Another option would be to play a song with a game, passing a ball, and when the music stops, the person with the ball has to introduce themselves, or the whole class says, "What is your name?" and the student responds in a more fun, relaxed way. Would also be assessing this objective. So there's different ways that you could go about having the students introduce themselves, but the key thing here is you really want to keep that assessment attached to the objective. How about the second one? Students will be able to recognize and produce the long and short A sound. So A versus A. And for your assessment, you have circle one of two pictures to match a written word, such as CAT. They circle either a cat or a cot. Is that a good match for this assessment? Or for this objective, rather. Yeah. Distinguishing between a cat and a cot doesn't help you understand the verbs, right? A cat and a cot, you're just looking at the pictures. So you're just testing, is this animal or is this bed matched to this word? So you're testing whether they know how to spell cat, basically. but they're not producing, they're not recognizing, and it has nothing to do with the sounds. So can anyone think of a better formative assessment for that objective? Circling doesn't help with pronunciation, but you could create a circling activity that does match this objective. For example, if you say if they have long A and short A, if you wanted them to know those terminology, you could say cat, and they would have to circle short A, for example. Or if you're practicing the difference between P and B, you say ball, and they have to circle B. So circling words is not necessarily bad in itself, but it has to be meeting that objective. Another way, in terms of recognizing, you could have students do something, TPR or moving around the room. You say a word and they jump left if it's short A, and jump right if it's long A, for example. Yeah, okay, you could put them in different categories on the board. Great, because you also can have them be using kinesthetics, moving around. Then the next one got cut off, but it should say that the objective is to use basic punctuation correctly, and the formative assessment is to edit a short paragraph for punctuation mistakes. How do we feel about this one? Yeah, this one is not bad. This one fits. So it's not just because it's not just that we shouldn't be doing written activities, but if it matches the objective, then that's a great way to do it. It's you're getting the students to do what you want them to do, and you can see whether they do it correctly or not. Another important thing as you're doing these, so it is to pay attention to not just go through the motions, but to pay attention to whether your students succeed or not in these assessments. So do they actually meet the objective? And maybe take notes. You'll probably have a lot of different students, and it might be hard to remember. You'll have impressions of Billy speaks better than Johnny, but you want to have some sort of specific data that you can use to inform your teaching, that Billy really he speaks well, but he really needs to work on his pronunciation, and Johnny really needs to work on his punctuation. Okay. Right. So two things that we want to avoid when we are assessing is we want to avoid assuming that the students understand when they don't, and assuming that they don't understand when they actually do. And that can be easier said than done. But there are many reasons why a student might get the right answer, and there are many reasons why a student might get the wrong answer. And it's not always because they know or they don't know. So in the chat box, can you first think of what are some reasons why a student might get the right answer to any one of your questions? Could be a test question, could be an activity, could be an oral question in class. Why might they get the right answer besides they just know the answer? What are some reasons that could happen? Luck, sure. Luck, memorizing, guessing. Excellent, okay. Copying. Context clues, great, that's important too. And why might a student get the wrong answer besides they just don't know? Maybe they didn't read the instructions. Maybe they have stage fright, misunderstood the question. Instructions were not clear. They're worried about things. The teacher didn't ask the question clearly, or maybe used words they didn't know. or confusing instructions. Not enough time. That's really important too. So when you're asking your students questions, make sure to give them some time to respond. Sometimes that's all it takes. And it might feel a bit awkward to ask a question and then wait and then call on someone. But some students are at that point where they just need a little bit more time, and then they will be able to give you an answer. But if you're moving along too quickly, then you're probably only going to get answers from the students who maybe went to cram school or who are strong in English for some other reason. So we want to be careful to understand the situation. We want to try to understand the student's situation more carefully. So some possible reasons for some possible reasons a student might be able to get the right answer. Like you all said, it could be a guess. They could just be lucky. So especially if it's a multiple choice question or a yes/no question, or something like that, it could just be because they are guessing. Another reason could be the answer is obvious and it doesn't actually test the understanding of a concept or question. So that could be when your objective and your formative assessment don't match. So for example, you're trying to teach an versus an versus a, and you have a picture of an elephant and a picture of a horse, and you say on the board, and you say, okay, point to an elephant, and everyone points to the elephant. Does that mean they understand an goes before a vowel and a goes before a consonant? No, it just means that they were able to look at the context clues and they knew what a horse was and an elephant was, and they weren't even paying attention to the a versus an. So that sounds obvious, but it's something that when you're teaching and you have 900 things to think about at the same time, it's easy to forget. So I think it's not hard to, once you stop and think about it, it's not hard to match your objective to your assessment. But it is hard to remember that that's something that you have to do. And that's something that you should remember in every time you sit down to plan a lesson. How am I going to see whether my students actually understood this and whether they are actually getting what I'm trying to teach them? Possible reasons why a student might get the wrong answer. Maybe they don't know, but maybe they forgot their glasses and they can't see the board. Or maybe they know the answer, but they are, as some of you said, are second guessing themselves or have stage fright, or they're nervous, or they're trying to impress a girl, or they just got made fun of, or any number of reasons that they could get this answer wrong. So we don't always know what's going on in our students' minds. And I have one example of this from my own teaching. Once I was, several years ago, I was teaching first graders, and we had to give oral exams, more like a quiz every week. So it was a formative assessment to see how well they were understanding what we were teaching throughout the week. And the question that I had to give this particular week was, can you ride a bike? And I had a couple other questions, and I had this little student, 6-year-old named Matt, who he'd gotten all the other answers correct. And I asked him this question, can you ride a bike? And his eyes got really big. And then he started frowning, and he started thinking and thinking and thinking. And he had this look on his face like he was contemplating the deepest question, the deepest philosophical question. And I thought maybe he didn't understand. So I said, can you ride a bike? And he doesn't say anything. He's thinking. And all I want is yes, I can, or no, I can't. That's all I want. So if I had thought about it, my objective would have been student will be able to answer yes, no, can questions with a short answer. So yes, I can, or no, I can't. And finally, I'm about to go on to the next question because he's not saying anything, but he's thinking really hard. And finally, he looks at me and he says, in Chinese, he says, do training wheels count? Because he really wanted, he was debating a very different question in his mind. He was worried about, do I count as a bike rider? I can ride, I can kind of ride a bike, but I kind of can't. And so he was having this internal debate over his ability to ride a bike, where all I wanted was, yes, I can, no, I can't. And so I think that that example kind of demonstrates that sometimes as teachers, we have no idea what's going on in our students' mind. And so how do we get to know what's going on in their mind? We have to take time to get to know them, make them feel comfortable, and then assess in a variety of different ways so that we can kind of gather that data in different ways, because any given assessment might not be able to produce perfect data, right? There's going to be some problem with any kind of test that you give. It's not going to be fair. So if you can assess in a variety of different ways, give them a variety of different ways to show that they understand, then you're going to understand, you're going to have a better picture of how well your students actually understand things. So again, you want to assess early. You don't want to get to the end of the chapter and realize they have no idea what you're talking about. You want to assess often. So in every class, there could be, formative assessments don't have to be big. They can be just one quick comprehension question, or they could be an activity that requires them to produce something to show their learning. And in a variety of different ways. So that could be written, oral, listening, and reading. It could be kinesthetic, and it could be doing something at home, it could be doing something in class, it could be preparing something. So you want to give students an opportunity to show that they know what they've learned in different ways, and pay attention to their progress as they go. Okay, how to assess. Before I show that slide, in the chat box, what are some examples of formative assessments that you could use with your students? What are some ways that you could test what they're learning? Test whether they've achieved their objectives. Exit tickets. Okay, so you read about exit tickets. Does anyone remember what an exit ticket is? And besides exit tickets, what are some other ways that you could assess their learning? Right, so an exit ticket is an exercise. It's often an actual sheet of paper at the end of class to assess their understanding of the lesson. So it's usually something that doesn't take too long, and they probably have to write or circle or draw something. And it could just be a few quick questions about the lesson, or it could be, in an exit ticket, you could also say, what are some questions you still have? Or what was something you learned today? Okay, excellent. Just dedicate a few minutes to work in pairs and have them tell each other what they've learned. So if you'll probably have some experience with, when you are teaching, you learn as well. So to get your students to teach each other helps them to learn something too. And it's also good for them to put the things that they've learned, to put them into words, to be able to solidify their understanding of something. Yeah, have something the students must do successfully before leaving class. So it could be tell your teacher your favorite color on the way out of class, or could be a question, or could be an activity, usually a quick activity at the end of class. Okay, using something in the middle of class as well, 1-minute papers. For elementary school, they're probably not going to be writing too much in the sense of a traditional 1-minute paper. You're probably going to have to adapt for English learners, but that's another great one. I have okay, there's lots of different vocabulary games that you can use to assess. But as you're remember as well that you're doing this to collect data about your students. So you can't just let them do it while you're in the back looking at your phone. You have to be paying attention to what the students are struggling with and what they're doing successfully. So this could also be in the middle of class, anytime they're doing some sort of activity. Pay attention to who is getting it and who's not. And that is a very low stress way to be evaluated, so they don't feel like they're put on the spot, but you do understand better what they're actually able to learn or able to do. So some other ways to assess. These are not this is not comprehensive, but some examples. One important thing is comprehension checks. So as you're teaching, you want to check in with the class frequently to make sure that they're following you. And one of the worst ways to do that would be to say, do you understand? Or are there any questions? Because when you ask those, typically 90% of the class won't say anything. And a few will just nod when they say, do you understand? So ask when you're doing comprehension checks, make sure that you're actually checking whether they understand. One way would be to ask for simple yes/no questions to check for understanding. So that could either be, you could have them say thumbs up, thumbs down, or they could say yes, say no. And that won't necessarily get at a deeper understanding, but at least you could see on a surface level whether they get the concept or not. A little bit deeper would be to ask students to summarize a concept for you. You probably wouldn't want to just call on a random student out of the blue and make them put what you just said into perfect English and a nice summary. But there's different ways you could do that. They could summarize the concept to their friend. They could write it. They could draw it. They could give you a few words. They could brainstorm on the board. There's lots of different ways you could do that. Some sort of low stakes quizzes. Students will often get nervous or feel stressed about anything that looks like a test. So emphasize, and there's also a lot of cheating that is attempted, and they're tempted to cheat because there's such an emphasis on grades. So if you're just doing this as a formative assessment, try not to make it look too scary or too much like a real test. But you could have some sort of low stakes quiz, like a Kahoot, or like where they answer in a group, or some sort of game like activity. Voting with their feet. You could have them move around the classroom to answer your question. So left could be yes, right could be no, or it could be different answers, like different vowels in different parts of the classroom, and then they move according to what they hear. Or it could be different concepts like past tense and present tense, or add an S and don't add an S to the verb. So that's a way where it's not putting any one student on the spot, but you can see how everyone reacts at the same time. So you can see everyone moving or not moving. And if you have that one student or 5 students or 10 students who kind of wait to see what everybody else does and then join them, then that's something you want to look into. Is it because they're nervous and they don't want to be wrong? Is it because they don't know and they're just trying to follow someone? Or is it because they're not paying attention and they're just waiting for the others? So that should be one of the assessments in your repertoire, but it shouldn't be the only one. So you should find a variety of different ways, again, to assess your students. Other ways to assess your students, self-evaluation. So get your students to tell you how well they understand something. There's different ways that you can do that. So, for example, showing fingers, you could say, okay, how well do you understand this? 5 if you understand it completely, and 0 if you don't understand it at all. And then maybe 2 or 3 if you kind of understand it, 4. And you can get them to tell you how much they understand. Another way would be to circle a number or a smiley face or something like that on a piece of paper. This could be in front of the whole class, they show their fingers, or it could be anonymously. This works best if you have been able to establish a good rapport with the students and they feel like they can trust you as someone who is looking out for their best interest and not just trying to judge them and not just trying to give a bad report card home, but someone who really wants to help them and look out for them. So that can also be very important data. And again, this won't show you the whole picture. You're going to have some students who are going to overestimate their understanding and they want to look good. And some who are maybe too cool for school and they just say, I don't care, I don't know anything. But it gives you extra data, again, that you can use to put those pieces together. So you could look at a self-evaluation of how well they think they understand it versus some other tasks that they've been able to do that show whether they can actually achieve this objective, and try to figure out where is the problem, if there is a problem, and how well they're understanding something. Another way is just by observing them doing other activities. So during class discussions, see what they're able to come up with. As they're doing individual work, you can walk around, check their homework, check their individual tasks, and as they're working in groups, see what's going on, see what they're able to do well and what they're struggling with. So you can use a lot of these different things together. Okay, now we have a short quiz. If you're not able to join the Nearpod, you can type your answer in the chat. So you can look at the screen here. The first one is the following an example of a good formative assessment? The teacher asked the class, do you understand? All right, yes. Yes, it is a bad assessment. And Ting, can you go ahead and go to the next one? Yeah. Students play a matching game in English with English vocabulary words and associated pictures while their teacher observes. You can type in the chat for this one as well if you're not in the... Yeah, this one is a good formative assessment. So if you're trying, if your objective is to assess the word and the understanding of the word, then that's a fine formative assessment. And the next one. Students take a multiple choice test at the end of the unit. Yes, this is a summative assessment. That is not a formative assessment. Okay. And to hold up 0 to 5 fingers to see how they understand the concept is it's a pretty good formative assessment. Again, it's not necessarily the only one you should do, but it's a formative assessment that will give you some valuable information. So I would say A for that. All right, excellent. Okay, and then if you are in the group, circle how you feel. If not, you can just write a number in the chat. So do you understand it well? Do you understand it? Are you starting to get it? Have questions or need help? Great, so I see some pretty good, getting there. Yeah, and this is something that's going to come with practice. You're going to be able to see as you're teaching what works, what doesn't work, what your students respond well to. What you're probably going to be surprised when you do an activity and you think, and everybody did well, and so you think they understand it, but then you do another activity and they don't understand it at all with the same objective. But this can, you'll definitely, you're off to a good start, looks like. All right. So the last thing, if you are able to write in the Nearpod, go ahead and do that. And if not, you can write in the chat. Name at least 2 formative assessments. So this will be your exit ticket that you will try in your class. So maybe things that you didn't know about or you hadn't really thought about before today, and things that you will try in your class. Pairing students off. Right, so there's a lot of good examples that we can try, but besides the actual examples, the main thing I want you to remember is that we need to assess our students, and we need to match the assessment with the objective. So if you remember nothing else from this part of the workshop, remember that you need to match your objective to your assessment. And that you want to try to collect a variety of data to help you improve your teaching, to help you serve your students better, to help you get them to the point that they can understand things. So yeah, a lot of these are great ideas. And I hope you'll use them in your classes. So Kara, if there's no other, are there any questions before I give it to Kara for the last? Are there any questions about anything that we've talked about? Maybe specifics about an assessment that you don't understand how it would actually work in practice, or why we need to assess, or anything like that? No? Right. Well, this is something that will come up again and again throughout the semester and the year, but hopefully you've gotten at least a taste of it today, and I will turn it over to Kara for the last section.
Hi everybody, how we doing? Still with us, I hope. Give me a moment. I'm gonna share my screen with you, and we're gonna launch into the last part of our workshop today. Always takes a moment to get the technology up and running. So we have spent some time today talking about the overview of lesson plans and following the PPP model, the sort of components that are really integral, and spending a lot of time focusing especially on those objectives and assessments. And now, for our assignment for you in Google Classroom, regardless of what region you're from, regardless for everybody, we want you to have practice with lesson planning using a template that we often ask you to use for observations, as well as to get used to this process of lesson planning and thinking through a lesson and those different components. What I want to focus on in this last part is kind of how do we put these pieces together, and what are some other considerations that we need to keep in mind as well. There's a lot of things that go into teaching. I think you're realizing this. And I know it can seem quite daunting and overwhelming, but I hope that by the end of our presentation today, that you feel that this is doable, that you have some direction to go with this, especially as you go into this assignment. So yesterday's workshop, Effie introduced us to the 6 principles for exemplary teaching of English learners. And this part that I want to address is how do we design high quality language lessons? And principle number 4, how do we adapt lesson delivery as needed? So we're going to touch upon these ideas, these principles, in this last part of our workshop today. How do we make sure that what we're doing is good work? So to get us started, I'm going to be asking for thumbs up, thumbs down, and you can type this in the chat box, or you can show me with your camera on a thumbs up or thumbs down. My first statement is the most important thing when planning lesson activities is to make them engaging. So if you agree with this statement, show me a thumbs up, or you can write it in the chat box. If you disagree with this, you can give a thumbs down. And if you're not sure, you can always go with the middle road. All right, I'm seeing some thumbs up. I'm seeing some are down. Okay. So I'm guessing that some of you are saying engagement is important. It's something we want to keep in mind in our classroom. Some of you are thinking, well, there may be some other things we need to consider and factor into. So with that in mind, we'll get to that. My next statement for you, thumbs up, thumbs down, meeting all of students' needs in a lesson is doable. So if you agree with this statement, thumbs up. If you disagree, thumbs down. Oh, I'm seeing some thumbs down. Such a pessimistic view. Certainly it's challenging, isn't it? Because in part, especially where we're sitting right now, we don't know what all those students' needs are. But it is part of our job as teachers to address them, right? So we'll talk a little bit more about this as well. And lastly, thumbs up, thumbs down, creating supplemental activities that meet unit objectives is challenging. Would you agree with that, or do you disagree? How do you feel about those objectives? And your ability to create them. Okay, I see some confidence there. And even if you're kind of like, well, I know I should be this, but I feel kind of this and maybe like that, that's okay. This is something that will come with practice for sure. So meaning that hopefully this will become something that becomes less challenging, right? Okay, on with it. So besides objectives, besides formative assessments, what else do we need to consider when lesson planning? So many things. Let's break it down a little bit. So have you heard of scaffolding? Maybe you've heard it in terms of construction. There's a building with scaffolding. We also use this term a lot when we talk about how we build a lesson and the need for building these extra sort of platforms or layers within a lesson that help bring our students along, especially if they're at different levels. So there are some connected theories, and I don't want to spend a lot of time in theory. This is not a graduate course in TESOL, but I think it's helpful to kind of, these theories I think are steeped in a lot of logic, and I think are helpful for us to know about. So one is the zone of proximal development. This is Vygotsky. He's a, yeah, these are some names that you might start to hear over and over again if you delve into the field of education. Another is Krashen. He's a big part of TESOL theory. And one of his theories is the input hypothesis, and another is the effective filter hypothesis. And I'll explain these a little bit more. With Vygotsky, he likes to think of things in sort of I like this visual here of where we have to consider our emotional state when we're learning. So if things seem very far and out of grasp and overly challenging, we tend not to learn them because we have anxiety. We feel it's not achievable. We give up. At the same time, if things are too easy, then we tend to become bored and disengage. And so our job as educators, what we can take from this idea is that we want to keep our learning within that zone of proximal development where students can feel that it's easy enough for them to engage in, but not too easy that they get bored, that they're challenged by it, but it's not so hard that they are anxious and give up. Whew. It's something to consider. All right. Then with Krashen, let's talk about the comprehensive input hypothesis, this idea that we want to teach something kind of, again, in keeping with Vygotsky, of we want to make sure what we're teaching is not too easy or too challenging, but a little bit, maybe like a little something extra. So this idea of the input plus one, like a little bit further ahead to kind of keep them going. What that is, yeah, that's a difficult thing to define. My probably favorite Krashen theory of all, though, is the effective filter, because this is one I definitely feel as a language learner, a learner of much of anything in life. Whenever I've attempted something new, I have a lot of emotions around it. Like, am I going to be good at it? Am I going to suck? This is really hard. And when I feel a bit overwhelmed, I tend not to take in what's being taught to me. Maybe you've had a similar experience. And this relates to this idea of the effective filter. If you can think of us each having a sort of wall or a net, as it's shown here in this slide, and if the more heightened our emotions are, be they, negative emotions or even really overly excited emotions, it's really hard for things to penetrate, to come through, new input, new information. And this is the same for students. If they feel overly excited by you in the classroom, which might be the first day, probably a lot of what you're going to say may not really go through and compute. Same thing as if you have had that interaction where someone comes to you and speaks to you in a language that you don't know at all, and they're just directing that at you, and you have this moment of kind of like, ooh, I should know this, I don't know what to say. Even if there are some words there that maybe are comprehensible, you may not be registering that just for the fact that you're very nervous in this situation, that the emotions are kind of creating that wall or causing that wall to go up a little higher. So part of what we want to do as educators is lower the effective filter. And we want to be mindful that what we present in the classroom is going to challenge students, but not too much that they turn off. So this is where scaffolding is really, really helpful, because scaffolding is helping us to find that happy medium, to kind of keep those feelings in check without overwhelming our students, and providing them places where they can latch onto within the lesson. And I like this visual because I think it also helps to demonstrate what our role is as teachers within a lesson and a unit of study. When we're introducing information, a lot of times it's in this very teacher-dominant role. We're the inputter. We're putting that information out and the students are receiving it. But within the lesson, as Tom explained, we want to move towards a practice part of the lesson where students are having an opportunity to feel safe in practicing these new ideas and this new knowledge, and having an opportunity to do that with some guidance on our part. And then we want to move into a part of the lesson where they can actually do this work rather independently and produce this. And that would be the more assessment part of the lesson, or the production part of the lesson. So here we have that PPP coming through. Another reason why we want to use scaffolding is this very important notion of differentiation. It's a mouthful. And I'm curious how you might define differentiation. What do you know about it? So if you could take a moment and put your best definition forward in the chat box. And let's see what your thoughts on this word are or what it could mean. Anybody feeling brave? Take a gander. It's okay to be wrong. So providing different instruction to different students. Jacob, you said that very well. I like that. Let's go with that. I think that's a really great working definition. When we go back to that anticipation guide at the beginning part of my part of this workshop, I asked you if it's possible to meet all students' needs. And the thing is, that's our goal. We try our best to do that. And how we do that is trying to find ways to differentiate, meet those different needs, student needs, doing within the lesson. So another way to think of it is having a variety of teaching techniques, and I've seen in the comments strategies and lesson adaptations that we can use to instruct a diverse group of students and their diverse learning needs, all within the same classroom. So I really like this cartoon because we have to remind ourselves that things cannot necessarily be a one-size-fits-all approach, that we should keep in mind that there are different sizes and different needs out there. So where can we differentiate? Well, within the practice part of the lesson, we can differentiate in how we deliver instructions to students. So finding ways to do that in different ways. So maybe not just always giving it, but finding ways to model it, or finding ways to write it, or having students demonstrate it. Within the process, so the practice part of the lesson, our crafting of the lesson, how we design it for students. We can also think of the production part, what kind, what we want the students actually produce. Maybe we're asking or giving students options of different ways they can show their learning. We can also think about what kinds of information they will study and differentiate with the kind of content we're actually delivering or giving within the course of a classroom. And back to that assessment piece, how we measure students and what they've learned. We can even differentiate by how we group students. So while a lot of classrooms in Taiwan are traditionally kind of in single row files and students sitting singularly, you do find in some classrooms students are grouped together, and some teachers are quite happy to group students. And if you put you can always just do random grouping, but there can also be real thought behind how you're grouping students and thinking about students who are perhaps a bit more proficient in their levels, working with students who are a little bit lower, and having more purposeful or intentional grouping or pairing. Another really important and sort of diehard component of lesson planning and just being in the world of teaching is Bloom's taxonomy. Have any of you heard of this? Are any of you familiar with it? Thumbs up, down, head nods. Yeah. So a lot of us and a lot of where our lessons live in this pyramid of learning are in the lower levels around understanding and remember. They're pretty fun. They're foundational, as we see here in this triangle. We need them. We need to start there. But what we also want to keep in mind is we want to make sure that we don't always live there within our lesson, that although we're introducing students to new vocabulary, that we actually have them applying those words and using them in context, or developing and creating context. So that's a really important part of what our work is too in planning lessons. So keeping all of this in mind, some very common scaffolding strategies are those presented here: modeling, bridging, contextualizing, schema building, text representation, and developing metacognition. Sounds heavy. And I don't want to necessarily dive into all of these in our time today, but really touch upon the things that probably you would already be doing in the classroom if you've spent time already teaching, or that you have easily observed in your own learning. So we're going to focus on 4 scaffolds, the first one being modeling. And modeling is just showing and giving a clear example to students of what's expected of them. So TPR is a great example of this as an approach that we talked about yesterday, that total physical response, where you might demonstrate using gestures of what a certain action verb means just by doing it, and then having students replicating that. And in the course of doing that, you're modeling. So modeling is a super accessible, super easy way to help scaffold and create additional avenues of understanding for students. Another one is bridging. And bridging is building new concepts on previous knowledge. This is one that sometimes gets lost when we're in the thick of teaching from a textbook, because we tend to teach each unit in sort of isolation. But it's important that we're building upon what students have already learned and making sure that we don't forget those past lessons and vocabulary, and that we're building on and expanding upon what students have already learned. And we can do this through things like anticipation guides, through different ways of reviewing with students. Probably one of my more favorite scaffolds is contextualizing, and it's building the context of what we're trying to share with them. So if you're giving a presentation on yourselves and where you're from, bringing in things that help to show that, pictures, film, maybe some things from your hometown that are physical. We often call those, excuse me, things realia, help to build that context. If you're talking about certain holidays, having things in their sort of physical form or having pictures of them are a great way for learners to see what is meant. So this is where showing video clips, having pictures is a great and easy way to provide more context and for students to glean additional meaning without relying so much on language. And the last scaffold that I want to introduce to you is schema building. And this is where we're using clusters of concepts that are interconnected. So we often utilize this scaffold when we use graphic organizers, things like Venn diagrams, or helping students to sort of sort and categorize information using some sort of graphic to help them along. So these are simple things to think about and simple ways to inherently scaffold. A couple of other ideas are presented here. And I like using sentence starters. This is another way that I think can be really, really helpful. Okay, so part of your work yesterday was to start looking through some typical English textbooks that are used here in Taiwan. And I want to spend a little bit of time dissecting them and how we might create an activity based off of some of the concepts in here. So kind of putting all these pieces we've been talking about together. So first, one thing that I wonder if you noticed in your perusing of the textbooks yesterday, for those of you that were able to do that, did you notice the commonality in the components of a lot of these books? You're wanting me to tell you what they are. All right, no problem. One is vocabulary. Every unit starts off with vocabulary and introducing those words. Typically, there's going to be some sort of dialogue or role play or storytelling, depending on what grade level it is. And using, again, vocabulary or introducing more. There's almost always going to be some sort of grammar, or in younger, like more elementary level, they often call it sentence patterns, but some sort of grammatical component. Usually some sort of reading. Elementary school, this might be more in the dialogue or storytelling. And of course, listening, which is really, really helpful for students to hear the words. So with some listening exercises, there's some emphasis on pronunciation. In elementary school, this is usually known as phonics. They're practicing different sounds. So here's sort of that breakdown. Pretty much, you can probably guarantee that most textbook units will have these components within them: the vocabulary, story reading, grammar, sentence patterns, listening, and phonics. So this is helpful to keep in mind when you are lesson planning. Are you going to do all of this in one lesson? No, 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 no. That would take much more time than 40 or 45 minutes. So you might, for example, if you're beginning a new unit, you might be just focused on introducing the vocabulary. And your co-teacher might task you with coming up with a vocabulary activity, one to introduce the vocabulary, or if it's already been introduced, to review it, because we want to make sure students are retaining that information, right? So regardless, you're tasked with an activity. This is very commonly what happens with a lot of UTAs. And you want to make sure when you're designing this activity that you allow students to practice and produce those textbook concepts. So while you can integrate and find, for example, a vocabulary type of activity, you want to make sure that it's in keeping with what the textbook covers. You want to make sure that that activity has a purpose and that it's working towards the lesson's objectives. That might seem obvious, but sometimes this gets lost because we want to make sure that the kids are having fun and that it's engaging. And we might lose track of like, oh yeah, this needs to also work towards this lesson's objective. And that'll be an important part of your lesson planning and your conversations with your co-teachers, is making sure that even if you're not writing out formally the objective to every lesson, that it's understood by both of you when you go into the classroom and when you go into your planning. You want to make sure that your activities are able to invite students of all levels to successfully participate. We don't want to leave students behind. So again, relying on those scaffolds and thinking about, how do I teach this to students? And we want to make sure we're doing more than just introducing new information. We want students to be able to play with it, to be able to practice it, to apply it, to create with it. So I'm going to give you an example of an activity you could do. And I'm going to go through some of these steps with you. And this hopefully will give you some ideas of how you might approach your planning as with your assignment in Google Classroom for today. So the activity I'm going to share with you, it's called Act, Draw, and Describe. And this is a really great vocabulary review game. It kind of incorporates charades and gestures and, well, that is charades, and Pictionary. It's kind of a combination of several of these maybe more familiar games to you. So I want to start with my objective and make sure that what I'm doing is connected to it. So maybe my objective would be students will be able to act, draw, and describe Unit 2 vocabulary and preparation to use words in context. So I want to make sure I identify which words we're using. I'm using words from the unit that I just showed you. So sheep, fox, kangaroo, horse, rabbit. These are animals. I need to think about what kind of scaffolds I'm going to use to introduce this activity when teaching it. So I'm probably going to want to make sure that I model what acting means and what drawing means and speaking. Sometimes we forget in our planning that we have to really think about how we're going to give the instructions, especially with students with limited language. So I'm going to make sure that I am showing what acting means and showing what drawing means and showing what speaking means, especially if those are not words that my students have in their vocabulary yet. I might also want to think about using bridging to remind my students what the Unit 2 vocabulary are, assuming that I've already introduced these words to them in a previous lesson. So I might ask them, tell me what they are, or show me what they are, if we've introduced them using TPR. So in this, I'm thinking through, what do I need to do to prepare for this lesson? I need to write out all these vocabulary words each on an individual index card. And I need 3 note cards or index cards, one that says act, one that says draw, one that says describe. And I want to make sure that I set up whatever board or platform I have in the classroom, because this is a competition. We're going to have team 1 or team 2, or maybe come up with some different names. But I want to think through what are the steps that I need to make sure I do leading up to this activity being productive and a success in the classroom. So this is going to be similar to what you're going to be doing tonight. And here's sort of the beginning parts of my lesson, where I'm putting in all this information that I've already shared with you. And you can see where this all goes using that template that Tom started to introduce to us at the beginning of the lesson. And you're going to find this template in Google Classroom. We have it already there for you. And this is one that we would really like for you to try to use, because it helps to structure your lesson around the presentation of new information, the practice of that information, and the production and assessment of that information. So helping you to really think through those components of the lesson. And it's also, as Effie mentioned, sometimes it's helpful for us to plan backwards. So thinking at first about what your assessment is going to be. So I need to grapple with some questions here as I'm planning this activity. I need to know, were students familiar with the word that they had to act, draw, or describe during the activity? So I'm assessing that. Maybe I need to have more review with them if they seem not to be catching on what to do. Or maybe I need to scaffold my instructions better, or do a little bit more bridging before we get into this activity. I need to also ask, were students able to participate in the activity without extra scaffolds? I might allow them to use their textbook. That could be a scaffold. Or I might give them hints when it's their turn to come up to the board to act, draw, or describe. So I'm going to be assessing, as we're performing this activity, what they're understanding and what they may need more time or help with. And in general, I'm going to also just be thinking about how can students use this target language meaningfully in a sentence. So where am I going with this activity? Not necessarily in this lesson, but thinking bigger picture. So hopefully in the next lesson, I'm planning another activity where, now that I know that they know these words, they're able to use them in more context. Ultimately, the biggest question I need to assess is, was the lesson's objective met? So it all comes back down to that. Okay, during the lesson, we're setting it up, getting the students into teams, explaining the rules, using those scaffolds. I want to make sure that I'm having students demonstrate this as we go through it. I want to make sure that I'm clear that if there's time limits, what those are, and thinking about how I'm going to share that information with students. If there are specific rules, I want students to know what they are. So I need to think through to make sure that the rules are not too complicated, and how I might show them, especially if they don't have a lot of language yet. So here I'm just explaining some of those rules, and this PowerPoint and these descriptions are all available in Google Classroom for you. So you can kind of see through this more individually on your own when you sit down to do your own planning, if you yourself need a model to help guide you through that process. Here I've also outlined what sort of materials I need to make sure that I go into the classroom well prepared. And just some ideas around things that I need to keep in mind in the moment, and how I might react or help students. So part of our teaching is also thinking through that part of sort of predicting how students might struggle potentially, or if it's too easy, what can I do in that moment to maybe make it a bit more challenging for them. And if they're, another factor I might see is they're not too excited to do this activity. So how can I find ways to engage them and make it exciting for them again? There's all those little components that come into in that moment. And it's really helpful in the lesson planning stage if you put some thought towards it so that in the moment it's a little less overwhelming for you to have to think about, oh my God, what am I doing? As we talked about with differentiation, it's important to think about how can I simplify what I'm doing for students who are really low level learners, who maybe are really struggling, maybe not real excited about English. We're probably definitely going to encounter some of those kids in the classroom. So if I have lower level students, I might have them, rather than describe and use words and language they don't have yet, to just act or describe these vocabulary words. And I might use a set of dice to assist me with that. So they could roll dice, and if it falls on an odd number, then they have to act that word out. And if it falls on an even number, they have to draw that word out. So your task as we come to a close in our workshop today will be to write a period long. So if you're thinking about a junior high school, that'll be a 45-minute lesson. If you're thinking about an elementary school, that'll be a 40-minute lesson, using one of those Taiwanese textbooks that we shared with you that are also accessible through the Google Drive. So taking one of those books, pick out a unit and think about how you might introduce some component of that unit, be it vocabulary or pronunciation or storytelling, and come up with a lesson and share that with us. We'll be, as advisors, on standby to give our feedback to you. I think this will be a really good practice for you, especially if you haven't spent much time teaching in this particular context, on what some of this daily work might look like for you in the very near future. Before we wrap things up, I just want to ask if there are any questions. I know I spoke pretty quickly and went through that a bit fast. And I know you've been sitting here patiently taking in all this new input for the last 2 hours. So if there are any questions, please feel free to ask in the chat box. Will these slides be in Google Classroom? Yes. Yeah, and if you're in the central region, they're already loaded there. Any other questions? If you have questions that come up, especially as you start to write up your lesson plan, that's probably where the questions will emerge. You can always reach out to us. I share with you again our email addresses and line contact for each region. You can contact me if you're in the central region at CareBear520, or if you're in the eastern region, you can contact Megan by line. And don't be, I know we both have regional chat groups, so if you have a question, feel free to also post it in those chat groups. I know it might seem intimidating because there might be a lot of people on it, but very likely your question is someone else's question as well. Thank you so much for your time today and your patience, and we're just really excited to have you with us, that we're beginning this work together, and we'll be seeing you next Tuesday at our workshop on classroom management. Have a great one, you guys. Take care.
Monday in the US, Tuesday in Taiwan.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.